If you've ever wondered why you or someone you know craves constant reassurance and fears abandonment in relationships, then you've found the right video. Hello and welcome to my channel, Healing with Charlie, where I share tips and information to help you start healing your attachment style. Today, I'm going to be discussing the anxious preoccupied attachment style. I'll break down what the anxious attachment style is, its characteristics, and how it can impact your relationships. So the first characteristic of an anxious attachment style is a fear of abandonment. It's one of the core wounds of this particular insecure attachment style. Some anxious attachers are so afraid of being abandoned that they become preoccupied with this idea that their partner is going to leave them, even when there is no evidence to suggest otherwise. Many anxious attachers pride themselves on being very aware and emotionally attuned to their partners, but many of them, if they're unhealed, can actually be unaware that the reasons their partner will abandon them and go into the arms of someone else is because of the way that their abandonment wound manifests and puts pressure on the relationship. However, compared to, say, the avoidant and fearful avoidant, they're still emotionally aware enough to understand this, and they can actually correct this once they've taken the time to reflect on past traumas and how this actually manifests in their day-to-day connections. Another sign of somebody with an anxious attachment style is their constant desire or constant need for reassurance from other people. And usually this reassurance comes from outside. So it's from an external source, say like a caregiver or a boyfriend and girlfriend or a wife or a husband. And very rarely when this person is unhealed, will that reassurance come from within. Now you might be saying, Charlie, but that's what everyone does in a relationship. That's kind of the perks of having somebody there to support you. And I would say that's true. However, one of the defining factors of an anxious attachment style is really dependent on the frequency at how often they rely on their partners to make them feel secure, to make them feel relief, and to basically quell these insecurities as they come up. In pursuit of external reassurance, they can often put this pressure on their partners, which for a lot of people can become exhausting over time, especially when it becomes a very frequent and recurring thing that needs to be done. Just imagine the other side and how much they have to carry that emotional baggage for that other person. It can be really exhausting. Now, I'm not saying that anxious attachers can't lean or depend on their partners to be there for them emotionally and support them when insecurities come up. But in order to start healing this attachment style, the anxious attacher needs to begin not relying on others so often. They have to learn that sometimes it's okay to run toward your partner for emotional support, and other times it's actually better to support yourself through those moments. Basically, they need to become aware of how often they're seeking support from their partners and what they're specifically seeking support on, because those can actually be very good indicators of those deep emotional wounds that are basically informing these insecurities. And once an anxious attacher can learn to identify these triggers as they come up in the moment, rather than relying on other people to make them feel better, they can actually start to reprogram their subconscious to not rely on people as much. Many anxious attachers, when they're pushed to their limits, like many people, will have strong, intense emotional reactions. Like avoidance, anxious attachers can have explosive outbursts and intense reactions when they're triggered emotionally. This is usually a sign that something has triggered their abandonment wound, and they've learned over time that intense, explosive emotions can help them to calm down, because there's usually someone on the receiving end that's trying to calm them down. It always feels as if you're constantly under a microscope, and that's usually because anxious attachers often overanalyze and they're very hypervigilant. So it's basically due to their hypervigilance and constantly being on the lookout for potential relational and emotional threats that they can often overanalyze and overthink their partner's actions. The way I like to think about it is hypervigilance and being emotionally attuned to your partner are two sides of the same coin for anxious attachers. Again, many anxious attachers are not aware that this is even happening or that they do this on a regular basis because it's so natural for them. It's deeply ingrained into their subconscious because when they are activated or when they're not, they're constantly on the lookout for any potential threat that could harm or risk their security. Ultimately, it's just a coping strategy that anxious attachers rely on to remain safe and secure within connection, because it's better to be on alert in case something were to come up so that they can react and resolve it very quickly, and then they can go back to feeling secure again. Think of it as a security system that notifies their deep inner security guard of any threats or security issues when they come up in that moment. And so because anxious attachers are constantly overanalyzing and on the lookout for potential risks, they can very often have trust issues. And as a result, they often question their partner's motives, loyalty, and commitment to the relationship itself. Anxious attachers are also the type to find security in big, grand, romantic gestures rather than finding security and comfort in somebody that shows up consistently day to day. And don't get me wrong, who doesn't love it when somebody puts in extra effort to show you how much they care about you? But when this is one of the few ways that you find security within a relationship, it puts pressure on your partner to always be performative, to always be pushing the bar to show you how much they love you each and every time. You can see where this becomes a very difficult goal and challenge to meet because the bar is being raised every single time. Now, not all anxious attachers are like this. I am, of course, generalizing, but many of them can become addicted to the dopamine and chemicals that are released when somebody gives you this big, grand romantic gesture. And very often they will find that it's hard for their partners to consistently meet that pace. It's one of the reasons why many times when they're dating avoidance, they'll typically say that their partners showed so much effort in the beginning and tried so hard and did so much, and now that we're dating, they're not really doing as much of the things that we used to show me that they love me. And you can see where this is a bit of a paradox, because at some point people need to take a step back in a relationship and just chill out. You know, as simple as I can say it, it's really hard to really be pushing that bar each and every day and every week with bigger, grander romantic gestures just because your partner may be attuned to only perceive love on that metric alone. Now, before I get into how this anxious attachment style can impact the relationship further, I should probably share a little bit of information on how this attachment style is developed, how it's nurtured over time. Often enough, it originates from inconsistent and unpredictable caregiving in childhood, but not always. Now, you could easily have had a great childhood with consistent parents, but maybe you've dated someone else later in life that had these same qualities. And the very experience of dating someone who is inconsistent and unpredictable, that you feel like deep down you can't rely on, is enough for you to actually develop this style over time. It's very possible to go from secure to anxious or to avoidant or any other style that exists, but it's really important to understand that just because you've had an experience with one person in the past who has caused these traits within you, it doesn't necessarily mean that the next person is going to be the exact same. So regardless if you had inconsistent caregivers or romantic partners, the effect is ultimately still the same. It leaves you feeling like you need to rely on others for security and for reassurance. And it ultimately always feeds into that deep-seated layer of abandonment. And that is basically the core fear of an anxious attachment style. So now that you understand a bit more of where it comes from, explaining its impacts on your relationships will be a lot easier. First off, just because you have an anxious attachment style doesn't mean the impacts on your relationships are only negative. Having an anxious attachment style can actually have positive ripple effects on your interpersonal and romantic relationships. One of the benefits to being hypervigilant means you're usually very attuned to the emotional state and needs of your partner. And who doesn't want a partner that is emotionally attuned to them, that knows when they need support, that can recognize when something's just not right? It really makes having those difficult conversations a lot easier because they can often be the one to sort of ease you into that conversation without you feeling like you need to take the risk to initiate that conversation yourself. So that's actually one of the positive effects of dating someone with an anxious attachment style. They're not all bad. Additionally, they can also be the type to remember really small details that you mention in passing. Like, for example, you may mention that you like a certain store or brand, or you love going to a specific restaurant, or there's just one memory from your childhood that you shared with them. Chances are they're going to actually remember those little details, and they'll bring those up at a later time to show you that they care about you. That is one great way that anxious attachers can help their partners feel seen and heard, because if they're the type to bring up that detail again later, you're probably going to be really surprised and happy that they actually remembered that detail, because it shows that they actually care. So dating an anxious attacher isn't all bad, but it does come with its unique set of challenges. For example, as I've mentioned in this video up to this point, their constant need for reassurance and their fear of abandonment can put pressure and strain on the other person in the relationship, and it can often become exhausting, especially if it becomes a very frequent and recurring issue over time. This can often result in explosive fights and arguments between anxious and avoidant partners, and will often result in other issues like resentment over time if they aren't resolved and addressed. And in their minds, when an issue comes up, there is something within the relationship or about the relationship that is triggering their abandonment wound. It may actually be there, or it may just be a false positive signal from their inner system that is making them think that there is an issue. Regardless if it is true or not, the issue is still very real to that anxious attacher. And unless both an anxious and an avoidant partner can come together to resolve this issue and put their ego aside, it's going to be very difficult for both parties to feel seen, heard, and valued, and for them both to walk off into that relationship feeling like a secure unit. Given anxious attachers can be very skilled at emotionally attuning to others, they tend to attract avoidant partners. The very nature of how these two styles interact with each other, especially during the earliest stages of dating, like the honeymoon phase, can actually create a push-pull dynamic, which over time is very exhausting. And if this is left unaddressed, then this dynamic will create a foundation for rupture and repair in the relationship. And that is what makes the anxious avoidant relationship so addictive. And it can be very hard for both people to walk away from, because it creates this cycle of rupture, which is a big trigger to your alert system, and repair, which often feels good because you feel like you're fixing things and it releases all of these happy connection chemicals again, only for that cycle to repeat. And that's how it becomes so addictive, where both sides don't even realize it's happening half the time, unless someone is willing to take that first step and start healing their attachment style and learning about the anxious avoidant dance and how it manifests within that particular dynamic. So a lot of that information was quite depressing, and if you're finding traits about you or someone you care about in those signs I clarified, then don't despair. There's actually a lot that you can do to change this. To start healing an anxious attachment style, the first step is to begin broadening your sense of awareness. When compared to avoidance, a lot of people like to consider anxious attachers very aware and self-aware, but they're usually self-aware because of their own inner need and fear of abandonment. When they can start to recognize how these signs and issues manifest in their day-to-day relationship, they can actually start to pinpoint their triggers and the strategies they use to get their needs met. Also, the anxious attacher's sense of self-awareness can often be very narrow and specific if they haven't taken the time to become more aware of how their strategies are implemented in the day-to-day. Since they're primed to be on alert for any potential threats, they're often on the lookout for when things are very secure and make them happy, or very insecure and make them unhappy. You can see how these are all polar opposites of each other. Part of broadening your self-awareness is to understand when and why something makes us feel a certain way, and the different ways those feelings manifest into certain behaviors. Emotions and states of security within a relationship are very broad, and it's different from one person to the next. So it's important to view them as a spectrum rather than black and white. When you begin to broaden your self-awareness and understand how your attachment style shows up within your relationships, then you can start to understand its impacts on the people you're with. Another strategy to cope with this attachment style is to openly discuss your emotions and feelings and insecurities with your partners. And I stress the openly discuss part because it's very easy for anxious attachers to put pressure, stress, and dependence on their partners to make sure their needs are being met consistently and always. And when this pressure is being placed onto their partners, before you know it, the conversation has erupted into an explosive argument and nobody's really communicating at a level that is meaningful anymore. And you'll know that this has happened because people will start raising their voice, they'll get defensive, they'll roll their eyes, and the conversation shifts to you versus me instead of us versus the issue. Now, I'm not saying that anytime a conversation derails and erupts into an argument that it's because of your anxious attachment style. Sometimes it actually is because your avoidant partner is just emotionally unavailable at that time. But healing your anxious attachment style has more to do with how you show up within a relationship and less to do with how your avoidant partner reacts and responds to your issues. That's a key detail to always keep in the back of your mind. Now, one of the best ways to really kickstart your healing journey is to seek therapy, to actually have a conversation with a certified therapist. I cannot stress how impactful talk therapy has been on my healing journey alone. It's helped me realize so much about myself, my needs, my wants, and the ways I would actually try to get those needs and wants met in relationships. I strongly recommend therapy to anyone that's looking to heal their attachment issues because it'll teach you to develop healthier coping mechanisms over time. Now, keep in mind that this is only a brief introduction into this attachment style, and it doesn't cover the vast nuance of how this style shows up from person to person. Just because someone has an anxious attachment style doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be as bad as I may have explained, but another person may actually be worse. So it's really important to consider that one anxious attacher is not the same as another. If you saw yourself in some of the characteristics that I've outlined previously, then I would encourage you to explore those at your own pace. It's very important to remember that healing and growth and personal development is not a race. It's a marathon, but it's something that you may need to embark on to have more fulfilling and secure relationships in the future. Working on your attachment style and how it manifests in your relationship is one of the best ways you can invest in yourself. So it's totally okay to be selfish about this. If you found this video informative, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might benefit from it. And as always, please leave your comments and questions below. I love hearing from you. Thank you for watching, happy healing, and I'll see you in the next video.